Good morning and welcome to The Dailyaus. It's Monday, the 29th of June. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Emma Gillespie.
Last week, Channel 9 dropped Karl Stefanovic, one of its longest-standing TV hosts, over a podcast episode with a British far-right anti-Islam activist.
This morning we wanted to inform you that Karl will not be returning to the Today Show or to 9. Obviously there are other projects that he's got on the go at the moment and that's his focus now.
Stefanovic launched the podcast saying it was going to be, quote, unfiltered and uncensored. And while that might be the case for the show, it doesn't mean it has been without consequences for his Australian media career. In today's episode, we'll explain why interviewing Tommy Robinson meant Karl lost his job at 9. But first, a message from Tom.
Hey, I'm Tom, Head of Partnerships at the Dailyaus. I lead the team that works with our amazing brand partners to keep the lights on here. And I mean that genuinely. As an independent media business, partnerships allow us to keep doing what we love. You can help us grow by hitting follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching this podcast. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, just go to our podcast show page and the follow button will be there at the top. If you're watching on YouTube, press subscribe. Enjoy the episode and thank you for being a part of the TDA community.
Lucy, I think most of the TDA audience will be familiar with Karl Stefanovic.
Yeah.
As you flagged in your intro, he's been a mainstay of the Australian TV landscape for decades, most of our lives, most of our listeners' lives. How is it that he came to be hosting a podcast where he would interview a person like Tommy Robinson?
Yeah, so he launched it beginning of this year after 20 years on the Today Show, 1 year off in 2019, but otherwise unbroken from 2005 to the present. As kind of a side hustle, side gig, he's got this podcast going.
Yep.
The first guest on his show, the Karl Stefanovic Show, is Pauline Hanson, leader of One Nation. And looking at the Apple podcast description, it says, quote, a chance for me to get curious. A few decades on the telly has given me a very good bullshit meter and an eye for a bloody great story. This show will be the people I know you want to hear from too, across politics, sport, business and culture. Unfiltered, unscripted, uncensored, I'll go there, why not? And I thought it was worth reading out that whole thing.
Yeah, because I think there's a lot we can learn from that description. It's really tapping into the sort of podcast descriptions of big conversation shows like Joe Rogan, US podcasters, UK podcasters who have been doing this for some time. But I guess we hadn't really had a voice like that in Australia before.
Not like a mainstream guy.
Yeah.
And I think the Joe Rogan comparison is apt because Joe Rogan was also a TV presenter.
Yep.
He was an actor on a sitcom, then he was a TV presenter. He hosted Fear Factor. So he was like a voice that people kind of recognized from TV.
From the mainstream.
Yeah, and then he starts this now basically the most popular podcast in the world where he's just interviewing people from all different walks of life. Like he's interviewing basically anyone, right? I mean, or he was in the beginning. Now I think it's probably pretty hard to get a spot on Joe Rogan.
Yes. Yeah. So with the Joe Rogan Experience model in mind, how has Karl Stefanovic curated his interview list? Who's been on the show so far?
Yeah, and I mean, Karl has actually called himself Joe Bogan, and that has been his approach. Yeah,
okay.
So as I said, Pauline Hanson was guest number 1. He has interviewed Holly Valance, the former Neighbours star turned right-wing commentator, former Liberal Prime Minister John Howard. He's interviewed Joe Brum, the creator of Bluey, although that was a couple of months ago, and basically from a scroll through, it's almost exclusively political figures and also people who are kind of espousing fringe theories, sometimes conspiracy theories. He's talked a bit about vaccines. He talked about ancient Egypt and whether it was potentially more technologically advanced than the present day.
Okay.
In my view, that's a lot of crossover with the classic Joe Rogan material. So I'm not a regular listener to Joe Rogan, but I know the kind of genre of person he has on the show. So it's like political commentators. It's also people who are talking about health, particularly men's health, talking about conspiracy theories. I mean, Joe Rogan once interviewed Alex Jones.
Yeah.
But one person that Joe Rogan has never interviewed is Tommy Robinson.
Okay. So give me the rundown on Tommy Robinson. Obviously, from that list of names that you have explained there, there's a hot button controversy kind of vibe surrounding most of them. What do we need to know about this British activist?
His real name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon. He is named Toby Robinson after, I keep saying Toby Robinson, I think, sorry. He's called himself Tommy Robinson after a figure in the football hooligan kind of scene.
Okay.
He is primarily known for being an anti-Islam activist. Like he is quite extremely anti-Islam. He has a very strong stance against the tenets of Islam, or his perception of it, right?
Yeah. And then in more recent years has become more of a high-profile figure of the anti-immigration movement in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. That, I would say, has become something that is much more part of his kind of brand.
Yeah.
I was reading an interview with him in a UK newspaper from probably 8 or 9 years ago where he was talking about, like, where I grew up, there were heaps of people who'd migrated or who were children of migrants. And he was talking about that in kind of a positive way. But then he was like, but Islam is so bad for our society. And now I would say he has transitioned into being a figurehead of these kind of rallies against migration to the UK.
Yeah. And if people don't know Tommy Robinson's name, they've probably heard of the English Defence League.
Yeah.
Because that's been a very prominent far-right activist group that has showed up at a lot of violent rallies and demonstrations.
Yeah.
He actually founded the English Defence League, right?
He's no longer associated with it, but he was a founding member, and that is a highly anti-Islamic organisation. It has been linked to the Norwegian mass shooter Anders Breivik. Members of the EDL have been jailed for planning to set off a blast at a mosque, and it's been linked, although I'm not sure that it was ever actually conclusively proven, to another arson attack at another mosque.
Okay.
And then another thing to know about Tommy Robinson is that and this is something that he talks about as part of his story, is that he has been jailed many times over the years for assault, for using someone else's passport to try to enter the United States, for contempt of court on 2 separate occasions. So one time he was filming, like doing a Facebook live stream outside court during a rape trial, reading out defendants' names in violation of a suppression order. And then another time he was jailed for contempt of court for repeating fake claims about a Syrian refugee after he had already lost a defamation case based on the same claims.
Okay, so an extensive criminal record. I think we could summarize that and say he is this highly controversial person. He's even been refused entry to Australia twice in the past.
On the basis of that criminal record.
Yeah, and that's why Karl Stefanovic had to go to the UK to interview him. Karl at the time was on leave from the Today Show and also on leave at the time of the episode being published. What happened in the interview?
What was interesting to me as a journalist, now you do a lot more interviews than I do in the course of your work for TDA, but I've done a few in my time. What interests me is, so he does one thing that I would do as a journalist, which is let the source talk for a long time without interrupting.
Okay.
That's a great way to kind of get someone to keep talking because people naturally want to fill the silence. But then if I were interviewing a controversial person, I would probably want to be interrupting and challenging them quite a bit more than I would say Karl Stefanovic does, just from a journalistic perspective.
Yeah. Because the risk there is if you're interviewing anyone with controversial views, that they use the platform as an opportunity to kind of monologue. And then it is the journalist, the interviewer's job to find the right moments to interject, to ask questions because, you know, whatever the interviewee says, it's kind of out of your hands. But as the interviewer, you kind of have that responsibility to guide the conversation.
Yeah. And I would say that Karl doesn't really do that. He's not really challenging him. At one point he says to Tommy Robinson, quote, "They tried to shut you up. You did a bit of time in jail. Were you inspired to come out of prison and keep going?" He wasn't really it's not really clear who he means when he says they. So that word they is used a lot in this interview, particularly from Robinson himself. And that was part of a conversation where Tommy Robinson was talking about being jailed after trying to shut down an Islamist group that is now a proscribed terrorist organization. He makes it seem like they're quite linked, but as I've said, he's been jailed for many things over the years, so it wasn't totally clear to me which one he was talking about. Could have been his conviction for mortgage fraud. It's unclear. Then says, "They've put me in jail 5-6 times, different times." And again, like, who's they?
Okay, yep.
There's a lot of things that are brought up in this interview. Like some of the things he says are straight up wrong. Some of them do have some basis in fact. The way that he's presenting it is charged, but there's certainly things that he says that are like literally true, but the way that he's presenting it is suggestive of an agenda.
Yeah. Okay. So the podcast goes up, I think it was Tuesday that it was published last week.
So. Yeah.
By Wednesday morning, it was taken down.
Yeah.
Do we know who took it down?
We don't know for sure. Emily Donahue, one of our journalists here at TDA, reached out to Google, which owns YouTube, and Google told us they didn't take the podcast off YouTube.
Yeah.
But it was taken down. It was then re-uploaded on Pauline Hanson's YouTube channel with the headline, "Cancelled," all caps cancelled, the full Karl Stefanovic and Tommy Robinson interview.
And that is when a lot of Australians started to hear about and learn about this podcast. It wasn't necessarily when it was published on Karl Stefanovic's YouTube channel. It was more that reshare of the full clip from Pauline Hanson. It wasn't long after that we started hearing reports on Wednesday evening that Nine was in crisis talks, negotiating terms to end Stefanovic's contract. It took a few days, but we did finally get confirmation that Karl Stefanovic has left Nine. That was effective immediately on Friday.
Yeah.
How did we learn about that news?
Yeah, so we learned about it on the Today Show first thing in the morning. His co-host Sarah Arbo says that he will no longer be on the show.
We've spoken to a lot of people over the past few days who have varying emotions. They're upset, they're angry, they're sad that this is all happening, and we all wish that it wasn't ending like this, and that we could, say goodbye to you, Karl, our friend, in a different way.
And then in a video posted to Karl's YouTube page, his podcast YouTube page, he said he's now, quote, truly independent.
Freedom of speech here and around the world is what this show is about. You don't have to listen to my show. You have the power.
And I think there he's kind of talking about like free speech as like an ethical concept.
Yep.
Because as I've said, I'm beating such a dead horse here. I've said this so many times on this podcast. Australia does not have a legal protected right to free speech.
Yeah, but we have some implied protections.
Yeah, exactly. And he also, I believe, is filming that in the UK. Look, that the background looked like England to me.
Yeah.
Without going to the detail of verifying where it was. So I think he's sort of talking about like the ethical concept that we should be able to have freedom of speech and freedom of debate.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
So Sarah Arbo breaks the news on the Today Show on Friday. Pretty soon after we get that video from Karl talking about, his next steps, his next moves, defending the concept and the interview of the podcast. What about the Nine Network? What have they said on this?
Well, interestingly, Nine also agreed that freedom of speech is important. So Nine Executive News Director Fiona Deer said, quote, journalists have an obligation to ask difficult questions. Part of what makes us tick is trying to understand why people are the way they are or think the way they think. We welcome open debate and challenging norms with constructive, balanced arguments. So getting to what I sort of noticed in the podcast is that he wasn't really drilling him in a way that would have been within the scope of his remit as someone who says he's a journalist with a good bullshit meter. Yeah.
And Nine had previously said earlier in the week and have been at pains to make this point that the network doesn't have any involvement in this podcast. Yeah. It is an independent product. There is no involvement from Nine in the guest selection and the editorial processes. So Nine has really distanced itself from the podcast, but of course has also recognized the relationship between Stefanovic and his presence on the network. And, ultimately they have decided that it's an untenable working relationship.
Yeah, and something that when you and I were talking to TDA co-founder Sam about this last week, he brought up the fact that Nine is a publicly traded company. They have a relationship with their shareholders. They're also, as a TV network, primarily beholden to advertisers who can decide to pull
their commercial obligations if they disagree with, the views of a presenter on a flagship program like Today.
Yeah. So Nine is balancing all of these different obligations as a primarily news, primarily TV company. So all of these things are of note and part of this discussion. And Nine's stocks have dipped very slightly, but they were already kind of trending down. So I don't know that we can necessarily see any impact of this on their shares as yet, but it is always a consideration for a company like that.
A really fascinating development, Lucy. I can't help but reflect on the fact that, this time a year ago, Karl Stefanovic and Kyle Sandilands, the radio shock jock, would have been two of the highest paid and most influential personalities employed in the media industry.
Yeah.
I would have personally thought that they had very, very safe jobs, but it just goes to show that you never know how things can take a turn in the media landscape. Nothing is really ever a certainty in TV and radio or Australian media.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Lucy, thank you so much for breaking that down for us. You've got a quick tidbit before we go.
I do, and that is amazing news for sad girls everywhere, which is that Phoebe Bridgers is finally back.
We love Phoebe Bridgers.
6 long years
Yep.
after that last wonderful album, Punisher.
Yep.
She's back with a new song, a new video called Lost Boys.
Iconic, a breakup with Paul Mescal thrown in there to no doubt give us some more heartache and pain in her beautiful music.
I'm counting down the seconds until the full album is out. Yeah.
When does it come out? Do we know?
I don't know, but I'm counting down the seconds until then anyway.
So Phoebe's so mysterious.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you for listening to today's episode. We'll be back a little later on with the evening news headlines, but until then, have a great day.